Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rubin Museum of Art. I'm Tim McHenry. I'm the producer here. And this is a museum, whether you knew it or not, that's dedicated to Himalayan art, much of it Buddhist. And the principle behind Buddhism is that the way to reach enlightenment, which I'm sure all of you would like to do, perhaps not necessarily achieving it in the course of the next hour and a half, but soon, is the marriage, the unique marriage between compassion and wisdom. And we wouldn't really be an effective museum of Tibetan art if we didn't practice that ourselves. But it needs a little cooperation. So the compassionate part of this is that we're offering 2 free tickets to an experiment next Saturday, March the 13th, in which the parfumier Christof Koch and the neurobiologist Stuart Firestein will be doing a little more than just scratching and sniffing. We will be analyzing how we process taste and smell by actually tasting and smelling some stuff and then working out what goes on in our brains as we do it. Stuart was here the first time we did Brainwave 3 years ago with a Raghavan Iyer, an Indian chef, and we actually tasted all these hot spices and turmeric and so on and analyzed them as they passed through us, as it were. So it was, he's a stunning stage presence, and I urge you, if you don't win these tickets tonight, to buy a ticket. But here they are. Now that's the compassionate part. The wisdom part has to come from you. And there's this innocent-looking little visitor information card on your tables or on your seats with freshly sharpened pencils next to them. And it's encouraged that you just fill this in with the basic information, at very least, of your name, somehow to reach you, email or address or phone number. And we'll collect these cards at the very end of the Q&A tonight, and maybe our author who we're celebrating this evening will pull them out of a Himalayan hat or something and award the tickets to the winning visit information card holder. So that's that part of the evening over. Aren't you glad? This is Brainwave. This is a series that really tries to explore a language, a coming together of different disciplines, scientific and non, and trying to achieve a common language so that we actually understand how our brains function. Very often we'll find scientists talking very intelligently about what happens in the brains, but we don't quite understand what that is. So what better than to get an artist who can explain or talk about that point of view or something that interests her and integrate that in a conversation. So we are celebrating the publication of a really remarkable book. It's called The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves, but it's more than just a history. There's a passage in it which Siri Hustvedt refers to. She'll talk to you about the genesis of this book herself, but I'm just going to read this little description. She visits a New York Presbyterian hospital as part of a series of talks at the University of Columbia's program in narrative medicine run by Rita Charon, and she's a physician who also has a PhD in literature. And Siri writes, her mission is to bring storytelling back to medical practice. Without it, she argues, the reality of a single person's suffering is lost and medicine suffers. Her distinction between non-story and story is one of focus, and she quotes Sharon. Non-narrative knowledge attempts to illuminate the universal by transcending the particular. Narrative knowledge, by looking closely at individual human beings grappling with the conditions of life, attempts to illuminate the universals of the human condition by revealing the particular. This book does both. It's non-narrative knowledge that's married into a narrative drive and a mystery that, well, it's not exactly Raymond Chandler, but it's fascinating in its pursuit of a truth that strikes to the heart, I think, of all of us and our emotions and analyzing who we really are. And that's really what we're about in this life, trying to find out who we are. And this book certainly is an unflinching view of an extraordinary condition, but written by an extraordinary writer, Siri Hustvedt, and we're delighted to have her back here on the stage. She took part in our Red Book Dialogues. Who was here for that, by the way? Anybody came back for the Red Book Dialogues that we had? Well, that was a remarkable evening, and we're looking forward to this as well. Thank you, Siri, for joining us again. It's really great to have you. Now, other than her great accomplishments as a novelist, of course, Siri is also known as a poet and essayist, and it's actually her essays on art, Mysteries of the Rectangle, that brought her to the attention of Hans Breiter, our scientist this evening, who was when I wrote to Dr. Breiter to invite him to take part, he immediately referenced this as one of the best analyses of art that he had ever read, and he encourages everybody to read it. But there's also a reason why he said that, because yes, he's a neuroscientist, but he's also a painter, a very accomplished one in his own right. So this is a very good marriage of a painter here and a scientist here at the Rubin Museum of Art. Professionally, he's a psychiatrist, and he's a neuroscientist at Massachusetts General Hospital and at Harvard Medical School, and his publications have generated more than 5,000 citations, and he specializes in addiction, mood disorder, genetics, and the principles organizing motivation and emotion. So he's here at the right place and at the right time. So Hans Breiter and Siri Hustvedt are going to engage in a conversation about the contents of this remarkable book published by Henry Holt. And then we'll open it up to the floor to questions from you, as I'm sure you'll have them. And then, I know you'll think this a little odd, given that we're a museum dedicated to Buddhist art, and that we'd encourage the acquisition of material possessions like this book. But think of this as an intellectually spiritual tome that you must have in your possession, because it will help guide you. But we'll go upstairs to the shop, and I hope you'll buy many copies for yourselves and your friends and have Siri sign them. So let's begin. Please welcome Siri Hustvedt, Hans Breiter.
Hey.
We met once after a lecture that Hans had given, and it was a really good lecture. I was thinking of asking you a question during the question and answer period, but I felt a little anxious, so I left. Afterwards, I came and asked him a question about how you create a model for understanding the mind, essentially. And because I've been reading so much in various disciplines, but also reading a lot of neuroscience papers, I asked him if he didn't think that a multiple model, that having multiple models, in other words, changing your models to investigate the brain might not be a good idea. And you were kind of encouraging.
I remember the end point of that conversation extremely well. It's rare that you have a really good-looking, smart woman accuse you of pantheism, turn around and sashay down the aisle and out. And I've never forgotten that. And I've always wanted to answer the question. I still really can't. I think you summarized my perspective on the brain with the comment toward the end of the book that, you know, here's a big box of the brain and here's a tiny little red piece in it.
Yes.
That's how much we really know about the brain.
Yes, Hans is in the book. You have to read for a little while, but...
Once, okay? She brings me up here, but she mentions me only once.
I mentioned you once, but also if you noticed earlier in the book, I do not give your name, but I say that I had heard a neuroscientist lecture who said that when you had brought up Freud to some of your colleagues, they had looked askance.
Yes.
Yes.
Harvard has a lot of wonderful people, a lot of wonderful, research going on, but it also has its models and its biases. And right now, biological psychiatry is really entranced with this idea of the brain as a bag of chemicals. It's kind of an outdated idea, but that's how they think about it, because they can get some chemicals to work very well. And so they don't like talking to psychoanalysts. The psychoanalysts are basically kind of off in a corner to some degree. But the psychoanalysts have 100 years of amazing, unbelievable knowledge.
It's true. We have in the audience tonight Maggie Zellner, who is a psychoanalyst and doing neuroscience research at Rockefeller.
Wonderful.
There's Maggie somewhere. There she is. So there is some connection going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My own psychoanalytic supervisor actually has been very much involved with my own research and guiding where that's gone. But I've had a lot of different influences, including somebody who's in this audience toward the back, Partha Mitra. He runs the Brain Architecture Project in this country right now, which is an incredible undertaking. But he and I met a long time ago, like 10 years ago, and we started talking about models of the mind and got into these rambling discussions. And he was very influential to me about thinking about lawfulness and principles and getting back to some very hardcore computational structure. And we'll talk a little bit about that and why that's important, so that we can move away from the qualitative ideas that permeate psychiatry right now.
Right, right. Well, so I'm going to briefly tell you how this book started, so you know what I'm writing about. It's a kind of long tour through a number of disciplines, but what happened to me was that I was giving a talk at a memorial service for my father, and there were it was 50 people maybe. It was outside. They were planting a tree in his honor at the college where he was a professor, and I had these index cards to give this speech that I had planned. And I stood up in front of these people, completely relaxed, no anxiety, no conscious anxiety. I began to speak, and I began to shake. Now, I don't mean a nervous tremor. This I've had many times in my life. I mean full-blown seizure activity from the neck down. It was incredible. So the book really was born out of asking myself what this was. I have to say, before I went to any doctors, I made a kind of intellectual tour of my own mind, and one of the things I came up with, that it was maybe hysterical. And when I say hysterical, I mean in the really old sense, that it was what they call in psychiatry now conversion disorder, which is when people have neurological symptoms, but you cannot find any obvious cause for them. So a person wakes up in the morning and is paralyzed. But when a neurologist looks at that person, they don't see any kind of cause for the paralysis in some conventional organic sense, as they say. Well, by the time I eventually ended up going to doctors, no doctor would accept my theory of hysteria. But the book is really casts a rather broad net and asks questions about the brain, the mind, and philosophical questions in the end. What is the self? What is unconscious and conscious? So that's the tour that I take, and I remain undiagnosed. This book came out in Germany and in England, and already I have a bunch of letters on my desk with diagnoses from various doctors. Now, and I'm not saying that all of them are wrong, but not one, there are no two that are the same, which is kind of interesting. And then also lots of cures. Infrared panels, that came yesterday, so lots of cures.
Well, Siri, I loved your book, and I emphasize it to anybody also. It's along with your rectangle, The Mysteries of the Rectangle, which is a phenomenal book. This book is amazing. It mixes kind of personal discovery and hardcore intellectual digging with this overall idea: who are we? I mean, that is kind of, if there's going to be an overall framework, I think that is it. and taking ownership of our emotional selves.
Right.
And you do it in a incredibly honest way. I mean, you talk about how in neurology and psychiatry. In neurology, you can have a tumor, you can have a seizure disorder. In psychiatry, you are schizophrenic. You
Right.
mention these things. So there's already this issue of being labeled. At the end of the book, you end with this incredible line, I am the shaking woman.
Yes.
You take ownership.
Well, it's this very interesting thing. You know, if a diagnosis is essentially a way of abstracting an illness from a person.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes this is quite easy, like the measles. You know,
Right.
you get the spots, they come and go, it's over. But with neurological and psychiatric illnesses, it's much more complicated because they really do seem to go to the heart of what we think of as the self.
That's right. I mean, what are we constituted? What makes us? Why, when we die, do we seemingly disappear? And you ask very hard questions, and you go back through it. I mean, you mentioned Wittgenstein in your book, but you formulate your book in the kind of the form that Wittgenstein wrote. You keep coming back to that fundamental question: who are we? What are we about? And that is, you know, to some degree, that question is one of the most important philosophical questions out there. The other question is, why is there anything at all?
Yes.
Why is there matter? The other one is, why is there behavior?
Right. Exactly. Yes. Why is there something other than nothing?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And you tackle the question of why is there behavior? Who are we as people who implement behavior? How does this come about? And you dig into an incredible depth of history and published studies. I mean, I was amazed at this. I mean, there were pieces in there. I thought I knew a lot.
You do know a lot. You do know a lot. But, you know, you cast around, and I think that, you know, we live in a culture of experts, and we need experts, and I love experts, probably as much as anyone. But what I do believe is that dialogue, conversation among people in various fields is so important because it allows various perspectives to, you know, on the same question, and I think it's important.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually the overlap between different disciplines where you actually start to have some breakthroughs.
Yes.
So we're seeing this a lot in neuroscience now, where people come in from biophysics, for instance, or
Right.
from engineering, and they have a very different perspective on the data itself, and it's amazing what comes out of that.
Right.
And that's why I mentioned Partha. I mean, he had as a theoretical biologist, he had a big impact on me in terms of how we were doing this across scale types of research. Of course, I read this and I was thinking, good grief, this is like the introduction for this type of thinking as a core. I think you've laid out a beautiful book.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I feel so pleased.
But I do have to ask you a question.
Yes.
St. Olaf, how did your family end up there?
This is such a, you know, and then I have to ask you, this is a personal
thing.
background. I grew up in Northfield, Minnesota. I went to St. Olaf College. My father was a professor there.
When did you graduate?
And they were planting the tree at St. Olaf.
Yeah, when did you
Yeah.
graduate?
I graduated in '77.
Okay, so you did overlap with my brother.
There you go. So your brother went there.
Yes. And he's a
Wow.
psychiatrist too.
He's a psychiatrist
Yeah,
too. Two psychiatrists? Are you offspring of psychiatrists?
No, we just have a very screwed up family. I mean, you can have families like the Ornsteins where everybody, you know, the two parents are psychiatrists and the kids all become psychiatrists, and there's a good reason. I mean, they're incredibly brilliant. They're very, you know, everyone's been well analyzed. There's not a lot of screwiness in that family. My family's the complete opposite.
Right. But, you know, I do find, I mean, when you do a little research into these various fields, you often find that people become neurologists or they become psychiatrists or brain researchers because there is a personal motivation. I mean, it's not in the papers you read, but when you have a conversation with someone, you realize that there is a driving emotional motive very often. Yeah.
Now, you had this motive starting very early on. I mean, you talked about something like auras when you were very young.
Yes.
I mean,
you know,
it wasn't just that you had that shaking episode when you were
No.
planting this tree for your father. I mean,
No,
it was a
yeah.
fascinating kind of progression of symptoms.
No, in fact, I couldn't have written the book, I think, really, unless I had been looking into this material much, much earlier. And it was actually, I didn't know actually until I was in correspondence with a neurologist in Germany, because I told him, no, he read an interview with me that I had done in London where I talked about having something called Lilliputian hallucinations before a migraine. It was quite a wonderful thing. I saw a little man and his little ox on the floor of my bedroom, pink.
But what were they doing?
They were just moving. They didn't talk. They didn't talk, but they were moving. They were, and they were so defined. They were perfectly defined, lovely little creatures. And I had this feeling of friendliness and affection for these. And then they were there for, I don't know, a minute or so, and then they vanished. But he became very interested in this, and we ended up having this email correspondence, and he asked me in depth about my childhood, about headaches, about auras, all of this. And he was the person who said, this has been going on with you since you were a little girl. And I think he's right. I mean, he absolutely convinced me. It's just that as a young child, you don't put the things together necessarily.
Right.
There's not an arc of connection.
Now, when did you learn you had febrile seizures as a child?
Well, I think I remember. I can't remember the first time my mother told me, but it was before I was 6 months old. I think I had it twice. And most people who have some kind of seizure disorder have had febrile convulsions as infants, and but that just because you have them doesn't mean you're going to grow up to get a seizure disorder. Right. It's a kind of backward story.
And the seizures that you actually had when you were giving this memorial for your father is very unique. I mean, I listened to the description, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard about in the clinical history. I mean, usually when you have a seizure disorder, I mean, you lose consciousness, you can't speak, and she's describing a situation where basically she's speaking, she's coherent, she's giving the talk, and yet she's having almost like clonic type the
it's
behaviors.
like tonic-clonic seizure movements.
And your brain is totally normal by MRI.
But my brain feels completely normal. So
well, I think we have newer techniques to go in there and actually look in greater detail. I mean, we can actually now start parcellating different components of the brain and start looking at their covariance and actually looking at a pattern and see how that pattern might be different. Because it looks like most of the people who have these types of issues actually have grossly normal brains. When you actually go in there, there's a tighter relationship that is slightly different.
Yes, I'm sure that, I did have an MRI for this. One of the noisiest experiences of my life.
But you didn't panic during the first time you were in there, you didn't panic.
I did not panic. The man gave me a little ball. I bet some of you have done this. And he said, if you don't like it in there, squeeze the ball. Which essentially was saying, if you're having a panic attack, squeeze it.
And it's an aversive environment. It's terrible. It's noisy and vibrates.
Noisy, and it was a very assaultive environment, but I didn't panic. In fact, actually, panic is not my modus operandi.
Interesting.
No.
I've been trying, but it hasn't worked so far. I mean, first time I went in for an MRI, I was starting a fellowship, and I knew I was going to be doing this a long time, and I actually had a full-blown panic attack. I mean,
Was it the noise or the confinement?
It was the heat. The fan had broken. It was getting hot. There was just all this pounding. The earplugs were not in very well.
No.
And it's just, you think about all this research. So you guys, every Tuesday there's another fMRI study that gets talked about in the New York Times Science section.
Yes.
You can't imagine how aversive the environment is in which these experiments are being done. It's incredible.
Exactly.
And the fact that you didn't even panic at all.
No, it wasn't so pleasant, but I didn't panic. But I mean, it's interesting that fMRIs can get results at all under those circumstances.
Right. But I have to admit, I've gone on record as stating I disbelieve 95% of what's published.
Okay, and I read that. In one of your articles, and this is something to talk about because everybody now reads the news, and we all see these pictures.
Like you see a picture that Democrats don't like to,
Yes.
versus
Democrats,
stimuli, and that Republicans tolerate this. I mean, it's
God spot in the brain.
Right.
By the time brain research gets into the popular culture, it has become sometimes just completely unrecognizable.
That's right.
And other times, they're getting at something that might have a point, but it's so reduced that it's essentially meaningless. The things I know very little about in the Science Times, I find myself interested in, and the things I know something about, I'm appalled. So that shows you. That shows you.
I mean, part of the problem is a lot of times people are doing things, but they don't have an overall model that they're trying to deal with. And that kind of brings us back, kind of like in your book, constantly coming back to this issue of who we are. What are we?
Right.
Like Wittgenstein would do in his philosophical writings. He'd circle back to the same topic after kind of going off and then dead end and then coming back. And you do that in your book. In this process, what has it taught? What insights have you gained about emotion or emotion function?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that one of the strangest aspects of the seizure business was the sense of duality or alienation from this motor sensory activity, and then having this, internal narrator that doesn't stop. I mean, we all have an internal narrator, that little voice inside our heads that's, commenting on what's going on. And I think, as I kept looping around, I thought it's extremely interesting how language occupies a very important part, obviously, of our consciousness. But there's a whole land that something like this seizure disorder, you become close to it in a sense. And that's why I also talk about dreaming, about the borderland between waking and dreaming, about certain, some of the most fascinating stories in neurology, people who see doubles, what does it mean to recognize yourself, all of that. And so I think that for me, it was a journey through some material that I had visited before, but I came, to, well, it's a kind of Freudian position, I think, that a good part of the ego, too, what we think of as is unconscious.
In fact, Arnold Modell makes the point that actually the vast majority of what goes on in the mind is unconscious. And so I think Jaak Panksepp also makes the same types of comments.
Jaak too, absolutely. And it's so that most of what we are strangers to ourselves. I mean,
Exactly
and I don't
right.
think that a neuroscientist today would disagree with that.
They wouldn't, but this is actually a relatively new position that neuroscience is coming to. I mean,
Yes.
there was a period in time as we were basically moving away from behaviorism, we're having this quote-unquote cognitive neuroscience revolution, where people were focused on attention and memory,
Yes.
and everything had to do with basically explicit process. But you couldn't use the term the unconscious. You couldn't deal with
No.
things that were hidden away, that you really could not access very easily. And more recently, as affective neuroscience has come to the fore again, the issue of talking about unconscious processing is very important. In our own work, we've just been overwhelmed by how important that is. So for instance, we look at trade-offs in approach and avoidance. And these computations show that the unconscious part of yourself is keeping track. Let's say you're doing a key press procedure and you're looking at 80 different pictures.
Right.
Okay? Your mind keeps track of every single one of them and how you valued every single one of them. Though linguistically, you would never be able to recite what that was.
No.
And we see this very explicitly in the computations.
And I mean, there are some very ordinary examples. For example, navigating space. This is something we do automatically. And the sixth sense, proprioception,
Right.
whatever you want to call it, this motor sensory part of ourselves, we are, a good part of that is completely unconscious. And when people lose proprioception, and there are a couple of patients, not so many, but people have lost all ability, that proprioceptive ability, and it is so hard. Imagine if you have to actually consciously evaluate where your hand is in relation to this glass. It's, you know, these people have to learn consciously to move in a way that none of the rest of us have to do.
And this gets at a very, I mean, and you talk about how little we know, and it's actually a domain that's of interest to my colleague Ann Blood. She's the deputy for the Phenotype-Genotype Project at Mass General, and I'm glad that she's here. But she focuses in on posture and motor control. And these issues and how these two systems interact is not at all clear right now. Probably her theory right now is probably the most advanced in this domain, but she'll tell you this is just a beginning model. These models will change. They have to.
I have a great question about, I mean, anybody who writes or makes art, or you who paint, this motor sensory connection, that, for example, the connection between typing hands or, a pen and what's actually happening is very deep and completely rooted in bodily and I think unconscious bodily functions. There's a woman in Paris named Claire Petit-Mongin, and she worked with Varela. You know this a Chilean man who was interested in phenomenology and neuroscience. And she talks about looking for the source of thoughts, which is, you know, a great idea. Say, if you're writing a sentence and you write a word and you look at it and you say, it's wrong. We all have this. Why is it wrong? You're not measuring it against something out there.
That's right. Now, how did it start to begin with?
It's an internal sense of rightness that you've gotten it wrong. And this is also emotional. You know, that this has this emotional core. So I know you had a little thing about continuum versus
categorical
layers.
Ideas and
you know,
emotion.
I think I made a critique of this in my book, which is
I
about
think I wrote something about that in here too. She's daft or something like that.
She's daft.
Yes. Or it might have just been a question mark.
It was really, actually, it's not to say that levels are not useful. I think they are. But it's fascinating how everything becomes metaphorical. It's very difficult to talk about any of this material without using metaphors. So there is a mystery between neural function. I mean, you look at what these neurons and synapses are doing in a brain, and scientists will routinely talk about neural correlates, neural representations.
Right.
And then on the next level, they'll talk about psychological function. Exactly how psychology and these neural substrates, in other words, fit together is not well understood.
Exactly.
And so there is a gap there. And I think it's not just a matter of two vocabularies.
Right.
It's a matter of something mysterious. And just, you know, I pointed out in the book too, but the placebo effect that I think people are studying more than they used to now.
It's an issue of expectancies and how did expectancies
and you work on
change
this all the time.
Right.
So but that's also the expectancy. Now, would you think of that expectancy as a kind of intellectual thing? I mean, thought?
No, I mean, the expectancies are computed.
Or do you think it's a
very
completely
unconscious
emotional...
process. It's a very unconscious process.
So, for example, you get a pill, and it's not the real thing. Like, say, instead of taking propranolol before this event,
or like making a bunch of slides before the event, like
exactly.
That was my propranolol, okay?
So that, what you're saying is that effect is subliminal.
It is an unconscious process. I mean, we basically, I mean, part of this has come about as a lot of perceptual research has started to point to that we put together a picture of the world, but a lot of the picture of the world we put together is based about what we project. We fill in pieces that we don't necessarily perceive. And we're constantly
Yes.
putting together, in a sense, a model of the world all the time.
Absolutely.
Now, it was looked at in terms of reward function by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky back in the late 70s, and they published something called Prospect Theory in 1979, where it talked about the effect of expectancies on subsequent evaluation or outcomes.
Yes.
And a nice way to think about this is, let's say you and I are walking down the street, and you're having to look to the left side of the sidewalk, I'm looking to the right side. You find a $20 bill, I find a $1 bill. And if I come from the Chicago School of Economics, I'm going to say, gosh, this is great. She found $20, I found $1. All of us know that's not going to happen. I'm going to say, dang, why wasn't I looking to the left side?
Exactly. Why didn't I get it?
Why didn't I get the $20? In the context of you finding $20, $1 doesn't feel that good. Okay?
Yes.
And so, for instance, you can do gambling tasks where you have roulette wheels with mainly gains or roulette wheels with mainly losses. And you can have a $0 outcome on both. It's the same amount of money. But if you get the $0 outcome in a roulette game, a roulette wheel where you're expecting a loss, you've avoided a loss. It feels like a win. And the signal in the brain goes up.
Yes.
Like you've just won money.
Yes.
And it's the opposite way when you get the $0 outcome on the good spinner, where you miss getting a gain, the signal goes down, like it is an aversive experience.
Well,
and that's an expectancy.
It's an expectancy, and it's perceptual, relations too. I mean, it's like giving a talk in a room like this, and there are just 10 people, you feel really bad. But if you're in a tiny little room and there are the same 10 people there,
That's
and
fine.
it's full, it feels good.
So thank you for coming. I took a look at Brian Greene. He's got the whole place full up. I got very upset.
But it's interesting. There are the idea in science is always that we're making progress, steady progress.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the points I wanted to make in the book too is that there are certain old ideas that get lost.
Exactly.
And for example, expectancy, which is something that Pierre Janet talks about when he used the word idea. Mm-hmm. But by idea, he didn't mean just up here. It's an unconscious idea that is creating, for example, a conversion disorder or a hysteria. And as far as I can tell, and I really looked into this pretty seriously, no one now is saying, the latest is Pierre Janet.
Right.
Except that we have brain parts, we have
brain parts, but
people,
science is kind of, it's always a very transient world. It's always about who is there publishing right then and there. And basically science moves on, and you get buried in the dust of science. You stop publishing, people start forgetting you very, very quickly.
Yes, and books, I was just rereading not long ago that wonderful essay by Thomas Kuhn that I recommend to everybody, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which for me is the best insight into how science works. Not just revolutions, but also the sort of day-to-day that there are these accumulations, and then a paradigm shift. It's pretty radical. Those are big. That the assumptions on which the whole science is progressing somehow get challenged and threatened, and then they have to throw it, everything up. Like quantum physics or theory is clearly one of those times.
And you can think about it in neuroscience. People talked about motivation for a long time with behaviorism. When behaviorism went out, cognitive science came in. It took a long time before we could start using the motivation word again.
Yes.
That's one of those dirty words that psychiatrists were not allowed to use for a long period of time. During the 90s in particular. Consciousness, exactly.
Think of this. Early in the 20th century when behaviorism reigned supreme, the nastiest thing anyone could talk about was, what is consciousness? Because everything was supposed to be seen from the outside, from human behavior.
There was a stimulus-response type of framework.
Yes.
You talk about that in that book. I forget who that particular individual was who says there's no such thing as the idea of consciousness makes no sense.
Oh,
Who
yes.
was that?
It's Watson.
Okay.
Watson is the kind of
But not Jim Watson, not the DNA fellow.
No.
It's somebody from way back when,
this is
a psychologist
this back.
from the
He
20s.
was, and it's very strange because this is in the 20s, and this is when Freud, across the ocean, is writing some of his most amazing work. So these are, existing parallel in the world, but there's no real
overlap or
communication.
crossover. I mean, in fact, you mentioned consciousness. Some of the most profound ideas about consciousness were actually made 120 years ago by William James.
James is the best.
He's just, he stands out. I mean, the more we dig into neuroscience, it's kind of like, how did he have this intuition? Where'd this come from?
He's just wonderful. And I have to say that I loved his brother Henry for so many years, since I was, really, really young. And it took me a long time to get around to reading William. And I had read, the biography of Henry and everything, and William was in the biography saying things to Henry like, why is your prose so convoluted? Can't you just, fix it up? And so I had this, like, the big brother William, but he actually writes beautifully, and the psychology is fantastic.
Well, his ideas about consciousness actually still inform the debate today. So I had a discussion with Christof Koch yesterday over lunch, and he is focused on consciousness and consciousness studies, but he focused only on one aspect of what James talked about, namely the issue of qualia. So
yes.
why is my sense of this red pen maybe different than your sense of a red pen? And
that's right. Philosophers go nuts with this too.
Absolutely.
And some people say there is qualia. In other words, that there's something about my subjective experience of this pen that is particular, my own subjective reality. There are people like Dennett, who wrote a book with a very arrogant title indeed, Consciousness Explained.
Oh, yes.
And he says there is no qualia. And there's actually a man that I have met once and communicated with a little bit, another a philosopher, Ned Block, who's here at NYU, who thinks that maybe people like Daniel Dennett don't have subjective experiences in the same way, that they don't have mental imagery, or they don't have, because there are about 4%, all these percentages are kind of silly, but a very small part of the population that actually do not experience mental images. They don't see pictures in their minds.
So what happens when they read a book? What goes on there?
Well, that's it. I was on a panel. My husband doesn't believe that this guy has it, but I was on a panel talking about Proust, and I wanted to talk about what reading is, what reading means, because when I read, I'm always making images in my mind, and when I remember a book, I remember the images, often not the text. I'll remember the people. I remember, Proust, the boy, and Marcel rather, and the grandmother and the mother. All these characters return to me as visual images. And this guy, he said, poet and translator. He said, "That's not true." And I said, "Well, it is true for me. This is a qualia story. It's true for me." And then I said, "Well, if you don't see the people, what do you see?" And he said, "I see the words." And apparently there are people who see the words. This is, again, the connection between neurology, our nervous systems, and personality is a deeply interesting question to me.
So we've talked a little bit about consciousness and qualia, but another component of consciousness is this issue of having a sense of you as an intentional object.
Yes,
okay?
will. Oh,
so,
we were going to do Libet a little bit, right?
Yeah, and talking about free will.
Yes.
And how, there's a large art. I mean, even what is the issue of an emotion? What is an emotion?
That's right.
This has been a huge discussion. As to some degree, people would say we really don't have a handle on that. And you talk about that in your book, about how much there are domains we don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, emotion is one of those domains, and I put some slides together. I don't know if you want to fly through these things, because then they get
fly through a couple. We're on the border, but go.
You want to just fly through? before this big hook comes and drags us on? All right. You were very brave to go after this issue, okay? I've written all types of papers. I have never attacked this issue. I'm not that courageous, all right? This is a very tough one. But it's at this issue of getting ownership of your emotional self. And there are all types of ideas that have been put forward about emotion. So some older constructs talk about dichotomy between this issue of communicating internal motivational states. And this actually comes about from Darwin. He had a book in 1872. He was intrigued by the facial expressions in his children. And he realized that they kind of looked like the facial expressions in his dogs and his cats and things like that. But these are kids, you know.
No, but actually, that's a great book.
And this is quite a bit different than James Lang. I mean, they talked about this experience of embodiment, that, you know, this kind of autonomic output, you experience this coming back.
Yes.
And more recently, Damasio has talked about this as a somatic marker, that you know emotion by how your body responds, and you encode that response. So this is kind of thought about as you know, there's an internal motivational state versus that it's all embodiment. That's kind of one conflict, and it's an old one. I mean, it goes back to all the way back to William James, who talked about embodiment, and Darwin, who before him talked about motivational states. Then there's another one talking about whether things are categorical. I mean, this started with Tompkins and moved to Ekman, where they had categorical facial expressions that were preserved across many cultures in the world. Now, work done by Panksepp actually is probably the most scientific, I shouldn't say most scientific, it's amazingly good work.
Yes,
but he argues
agree.
that there is a categorical basis for emotion, along with saying that a number of these features, that you can think about emotion in terms of a continuum. They're features that define mappings in an emotion space. So you can talk about the valence and intensity of emotion and put together all emotions on one big graph and think about what aspects they go after. So these are older concepts in terms of the thinking about emotion. More modern constructs think about emotion in the context of judgment and decision making, and they look at emotion as something that colors or biases your judgments. Also behavioral economics, neuroeconomics, that's a field that I'm heavily involved with. We talk about irrational decisions, about temporal discounting. Why is something worth much less to you just a few days forward as opposed to now?
Right. Well, I mean, just even broadly, you know, the notion, and this is something that Damasio talks about too, the idea somehow that there is this, you know, brute divorce between reason and emotion, and that if we could have this reasonable, rational self, we would make better decisions, is completely false. In other words, you need that. I mean, this is, you know, there are pop versions of this in the press too, but you really can't divorce these.
Well, most of your processing is unconscious. And the idea that you're going to have a small little bit of cognitive structure control this massive piece is very difficult. You know, neuroeconomics also talks about this issue of loss aversion, why we so much, you know, want to avoid losses versus approaching gains. It actually became prospect theory, which won a Nobel Prize in 2002. Affective neuroscience talks about emotion in the context of reward aversion, and the memory of how things have gone, and the context in which things in the environment might be rewarding and aversive. And in terms of psychoanalysis and then ethology, and I have to, again, point to Partha and point to Anne about this issue. They keep hammering me about this issue of ethology. I come at things as an experimental psychologist. But ethology has had a profound impact on our ideas of what is an emotion. And thinking about emotion in terms of perceived needs, environmental contingencies, memories of prior outcomes. All of these might be described in terms of approach and avoidance. Schneiderle, a whole bunch of psychologists way back when, talked about emotion.
And also the one thing too that's missing, I mean, this is just for, you know, because, you know, not everybody is steeped into neuroscience, but that, you know, brains are plastic, and they change. And they're most plastic, of course, when we're little. But, you know, what you're talking about here is also an ongoing process in time. Right. So that learning and experience are also, you know, playing a vital role in rooting the neural networks. And that's something I find that's really missing from the press. You know, when they're talking, they show the little brain scans and they say, it's as if the brain is static. It's not.
Right, it's not. And even brain anatomy, we're starting to realize, is not a static structure. I mean, there's all types of things we can do with experimental psychology and actually see correlations between the experimental psychology of behavior and a structural scan. This is phenomenal. I mean,
and we've been told we have to stop.
Oh, okay, then forget about, we won't talk about free
Say
will.
something.
We have a model of free will. Do we want to
Okay.
talk about it?
Okay, free will. The oldest debate in the world.
Well,
What do you think?
I come at things in the context of looking at principles, okay? And again, this is my friends from the theoretical engineering and biology worlds have really hammered me at this issue that behavior these days is very qualitative. What we need to do is start going after what is principled, what are the laws organizing behavior. It's fundamental because, and also thinking about things in terms of systems. This is something Panksepp pushed. If we don't do that, we're not going to be able to understand free will. This is a significant concern because emotion acts as a lens through which intention free will is projected. Even thinking about consciousness and qualia. Like yesterday, Christof was talking about some work by Tononi and putting together some very interesting simulations to think about qualia, but he was never talking about the emotional aspect of perception. You never see anything dispassionately. Never, ever. Emotion is heavily in this. And so this led us to kind of go back to what we were doing and actually apply some hardcore engineering approaches to behavior. And what came out of it is finding a bunch of patterns in behavior that meet engineering criteria to be lawful. They're recurrent, they have a strict mathematical formulation, they're robust to the injection of noise, and they actually scale across 2 levels of organization. Well, why is that important? Well, this issue of the law is a fundamental piece that's missing from behavior. Laws allow you to make predictions beyond just statistical associations, that things happen together. So you see these pseudo-color phrenological pictures in the New York Times, okay? Steve Hyman will call neuroimaging actually pseudo-color phrenology.
Yes, there's a lot of talk about that, about the new phrenology
Exactly.
are the brain images.
And the problem is that we're not thinking about what is lawful. What are the patterns there that we can extract and really understand across different scales? And there are few behavioral patterns that can be considered lawful. One is the Weber-Fechner-Stevens law. We won't delve on that. When we found these patterns, why is this important? It gets to this issue of emotion. Well, it allowed us to actually talk about a preference landscape defined by how you calibrate value, how you set limits in terms of a limit function, and how you trade off in terms of approach and avoidance. Now, this is getting back to the ideas from ethology about thinking about approach and avoidance. And also, how does time play into this? You can make this type of preference landscape as a discrete model. This is basically a function space. And you can look at how it's framed by environmental contingencies and hedonic deficit states. This is a quantitative model of emotion. Now, is it the model of emotion? I don't think so. I think there are a lot of smart people out here that are going to look at this very crude first pass and come up with better ideas with it. It's all of us as a discussion that's going to change this. Now, what are the implications for these patterns with regard to free will? Well, people traditionally have talked about free will versus determinism. But it's crude. Determinism in terms of modern science is very hard to talk about. I mean, with quantum mechanics and probabilistic ideas, determinism isn't the same. And the idea that there's free will, that we're completely in control of things, is also a problem. You bring up the massive unconscious.
Yes, no, I mean, there was this study that became very famous by this man named Benjamin Libet, and he discovered that about 1/3 of a second before we make any voluntary act, like moving your arm, there is something called a readiness potential that, goes off 1/3 of a second before. This called the whole question of free will, up for grabs. My feeling, again, is that you cannot make these kind of boundaries so clearly. In other words, that unconsciousness, pre-consciousness, is actually part of willful action.
Right.
And that these guys tied themselves into knots over something that William James, by the way, understood quite well. I mean, he talks about, at one point, putting that before he knows his hand is in the bowl of chocolate, it's in the bowl of chocolate. And so I think we know that. And I think we had promised that we would be done at 8 and open it to questions. So we're going to be good citizens.
Well, thank you for curbing your emotions. And in that regard, really grateful for this, this wonderful freewheeling discussion. We've got microphones in the house, so we'll try and do this in as ordered a fashion as possible. So if the first of you who wish to ask a question, do raise your hands now and we'll get those microphones to you. Well, we have one right here. So, how about that?
Thank you for organizing. Thank you. Hi. First of all, I enjoyed the discussion so much. I just want to make a quick comment. Genet, there's an enormous insurgence now.
I know.
Back to Genet.
I know.
And it's thrilling, particularly in the area of dissociation.
Yes.
And he was right on the money in so many ways, way beyond Freud, way beyond this one, that one.
Absolutely. No, I mean, he's sort of out of print in English now, but I think you're absolutely right. I was reading a lot of psychiatrists, a whole group in Holland, who have been reviving Genet's theories and I think doing great stuff with them. Yeah.
Anybody next?
There.
Yeah, why don't you just go from that?
Thank you both for coming so much. Okay. Check? Oh,
Yep,
there it is. Okay.
good.
So this is about a head versus a heart argument. I've often been accused, people would say sometimes, you're thinking too much, you're leading with your head and not your heart. And I've often said, oh, yeah, of course, you're right. I'm thinking too much. I should think more with my heart, and then it doesn't make sense. So I'm kind of wondering if you can kind of help me a little bit along the lines of where does the heart come into some of these discussions about brain versus heart?
No, but this is really an interesting question, I think. In psychoanalysis, there's something called intellectualization, and I talk about it at the end. And I think it was Anna Freud who first came up with this term. And it's when, say, an analyst is looking at a patient, someone comes in and he's talking about his mother's death, and there's just no affect. He's sitting there telling about maybe her depression and
the room
going
feels
on
dead.
and on.
It's like it feels like the emotion is just dead in the room when they
That's
talk
right.
that way.
There's nothing coming out. Now that's an extreme case of someone who is really not in touch with the feeling that's accompanying the narrative. But I think we all have certain splits. And I have to say, for me, writing this book, in some way, it was good because I felt, even though I wasn't going to cure myself from this disorder, I could feel a certain mastery over the material about it. And that kind of, higher cognitive function can be very helpful.
Absolutely. I would love it if people actually did this type of process. When you think about it, if every patient did this.
Right. Yes. Yes. Well, and also the fact that, this...
I wouldn't have to do anything.
What they call the executive part of the brain, that, the lateral prefrontal cortex actually plays a role in moderating some emotions. On, fear, for example, primed for fear. And if you can train yourself to lower levels of fear by, thinking about it consciously.
And also the biofeedback mechanisms that you talk about.
Yes, that's the other side, yeah.
Where these behavioral learning processes are very fundamental for being able to lower down that type of distraction.
Absolutely.
So you raise a very interesting question, and that question, quite frankly, could be a topic for another hour's discussion. I think Siri's kind of gotten to an important point. One thing that does get at is that, when Libet and Wegener, people talked about free will being an illusion, they were thinking that the only way we could deal with these impulses that come out is by inhibition. But from the psychoanalytic perspective, there are actually a lot of other things we do. We use our assumptions and our beliefs to sculpt that unconscious landscape of preference, or to change, to broaden it, to diversify it, things like this.
Yeah.
And so we actually are kind of, in a sense, the person who weaves our emotional landscape. And by doing that, we have free will.
Raising
There's
their
someone
hand.
here.
Okay, I'm going to. Okay.
So yes, I'm the Ann Blood who works with Hans, and I
Oh,
have a
right.
question for you, both to discuss about one of the things that's discussed a lot in relation to consciousness is the idea of memory, and that memory is part of what forms our feeling of consciousness. And there's some old literature out there showing that explicit memory, for example, for a list of items, is actually fairly limited. This is 7 plus or minus 2 phenomenon. Do you think it's possible that the unconscious memory, now some of the work, Hans, that you have done shows that unconscious memory can go much further than 7 plus or minus 2.
That's what you're talking about.
Do you think that the unconscious memory helps to fuel our feeling of consciousness? Do you think there's an interplay between the unconscious and consciousness?
Well, I think there absolutely has to be, and you know, I've gotten very interested in the question of memory and place, and how, you know, when you think about how memory works, at least in my own private brain, is that there's a lot of fog around explicit memory. I mean, that's clear. And before a certain age, what we think of as autobiographical memories are essentially fragments floating pretty loose, or maybe they're in some kind of architectural space. And what I think that the beginning of what people think of as a continuous autobiographical memory is not at all continuous autobiographical memory. It's that we can set a narrative inside a place that lasted, like your childhood home, and then you moved somewhere else, and you moved somewhere else. And that this spatial mental grounding is really crucial for it.
Now you talk about it also in the context of that one living room where you had remade a memory. You talk about Nachträglichkeit from Freud.
This is a crazy thing. It's also, Nachträglichkeit is what Freud's idea that the present changes memory. And, you know, the recent stuff I've been reading anyway, it's all about constructivist memory. I mean, no, it wasn't. It wasn't in the Rockefeller group. I was thinking it was, but it was in a paper I was reading, just that memory is a kind of reconstruction. It's reconsolidated. It's not fixed. But the memory I had, that's from when I was 4, I was in Norway, and I was carrying this around me exactly like this. I could see my aunt's living room. We were sitting around the dinner table. My cousin Vibeke, who's here, started crying, and she was older than I was. I loved her. I thought she was my idol, and she was crying. I didn't know why. So I got off my chair, walked around the table, and patted her arm. And the grown-ups started to laugh. My humiliation was so strong. I was seized by humiliation, which is, I think, why the memory stayed. And I didn't realize until a few years ago that it was the wrong living room, because my aunt wasn't living in that house, and I had completely forgotten the other house. So I took the memory unconsciously, put it into a living room that I could remember and recognize, and kept the memory with me. It's fascinating. So when, you know, that's a kind of error you can recognize.
Right. And so this whole area of kind of reconstructing memory is very fundamental, and is a fundamental aspect of, you know, how we have a sense of ourselves in the world. I mean, they talk about in object relations theory the sedimentation of outcomes from various relationships. Well, you remember so much of it. If this is a wave going way back down into the depths, hundreds of time points, you remember it. And that's the thing that is so amazing.
Well, you remember, I think especially emotional.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a kind of emotional valence, or something that salience, you know, that remains with you.
Here we have the question in the back. Thank you.
Okay, so it seems to me that a lot of your experiences derive from your hypersensitivity. And I myself am actually a hypersensitive, and I found very little information written on it. So I just had a few questions. I wanted to take advantage of having you here. I was wondering, first of all, have you ever experienced sensory overload and had a panic attack in association with it?
No, I've never, that's why I wasn't joking in the beginning when I said, actually, I do have these seizure things that I do think they're related to stress situations for sure. And once I had it climbing a mountain, which I think was brought on by hyperventilation.
Okay.
But panic attacks I've never had a panic attack. But
Okay, you have.
sensory overload, I think, is something that is kind of daily bread for me.
Okay. Because I thought that I had read something about you in association with panic attacks. So.
No,
But
that's one ailment that,
So have
that
you
I
ever?
don't have.
I had read something about you being hyper aware, and I was wondering in what kind of situation do you?
No,
feel
you know,
that
this
way?
is in the book. I have this little part about I was, reading as usual, and I ran into this paper on something called mirror touch synesthesia. Synesthesia, most people know, it's a crossing of senses. The most familiar forms are something like what Vladimir Nabokov had. He would see letters as colors.
Right.
Every letter would have an associative
Yes, okay.
color, but you really see them. Green L's or whatever. And mirror touch synesthesia was newly coined in 2005 by researchers who discovered that there were people who, when they watch someone getting slapped, they have a sensation themselves.
Right.
Not identical to being slapped, but that the visual looking is being translated into feeling. I definitely am one of those people.
Okay.
And so I do get sensory overload for
Okay,
sure.
that's interesting. I'm the same way, so it's interesting for me to talk to someone who has the same experiences. And also, what did you mean by experiencing auras?
Oh, for example, the little pink people, that was an aura, my best one. Other ones, other migraine auras are sometimes colors. Once I had something called donut vision, like a kind of gray black hole in my vision. And euphoria I've had before migraine too. Feelings of elation that are really, really pleasant. And once in a while to this feeling that you're being lifted up.
Now, do they get to the religious aspect at all? Do they go toward this sense of
Yes.
of a universal oceanic
Yes,
sense?
yes, definitely there's an oceanic side to it, where you feel so good and sort of part of the whole world, and that sensation can be associated. I think when I was a little girl, I felt that it was God.
Interesting. Interesting.
It's interesting.
Let's have the next two hands up for the next two questions. Okay, we'll get the microphone to you. Yes, ma'am. Keep your hand up so we can.
That's so neat.
That's right.
That's,
No.
Oh,
keep on
that's
going,
Maggie.
Keep on going, keep on going. Yeah. And
that's
then we'll
Maggie.
get
She's the one
microphone to
who
very front
runs
row.
the Rockefeller
Back row.
group that I go to.
I think we should do this just every night, like hear a great conversation between two interesting people. So I had so many different responses, but the main thing I wanted to ask Siri mainly, but Hans, you might have something to say about it too, is the really intriguing question about where do ideas and thoughts come from?
Yeah.
And first, I'll just say a subsidiary thing, which I think the more I pay attention to it and also the more I learn about neuroscience, I really do think that emotion and cognition really are separate domains, and they interpenetrate quite a lot.
Yes.
But, the state of being in a strong emotion is very different from the state of, being cognitively fertile and making associations and stuff. It seems pretty clear to me that they're different. And by the way, just if anybody's interested in the neurobiology of emotion, they've been talking about Jaak Panksepp, and he wrote a wonderful book called Affective Neuroscience, and it's really the starting point for learning about the neuroscience of emotion. So this is more of a philosophical question, because the sense of wanting to say something and not finding the right word, or having a word and knowing that it's not right, to me suggests that some of the stuff that I read as a semiotics major, was really questionable in terms of that very strong position that language constructs thought and experience.
Yes.
So I know that
good.
you have a philosophical background, so I wonder if you can say a little bit more
Well,
about that controversy.
This is very interesting. I mean, and I try to talk about it just a little bit in the book, is that, academia is split into, such different slices that it gets a little shocking. I know that you did this, that there is a kind of postmodernist theoretical position coming very much out of, I think, the French theory of the 70s and 80s, and also a kind of sociological part of that, which is all these books about the social construction of PTSD, the social construction of everything. Everything is socially constructed.
Right.
Well, to some degree, this is true. The error, and I think what Maggie is talking about, the error is that just because something is socially constructed doesn't mean there's not a body.
Right.
It doesn't mean that there's no biology. And a lot of those theoreticians, ended up driving me crazy because it is like floating busts. It's like there's no there. And that's one of the reasons that philosophically I've been driven back to phenomenology, to Husserl, to Merleau-Ponty, to a really embodied position of looking at the world. Merleau-Ponty is just the best, and he writes beautifully. And a lot of cognitive scientists are returning to Merleau-Ponty. Someone like Sean Gallagher has done a wonderful book, How the Body Shapes the Mind. And he's also done some, I think a couple of books, one book with this philosopher Dan Sahavi, who's written about Husserl. And I think that that philosophical piece goes very nicely together with neuroscience research.
I would concur. I studied with James Levy at Northwestern, who actually had studied under Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And it was like a breath of fresh air to talk about the issues of embodiment.
Yeah.
That we are embodied, that this, you can't talk about an idea separate from our kind of being integrated into this world and all the strains and stresses that come in.
Exactly, and that perception is an embodied act.
Exactly, and that's why, you get to these models like Tonini's,
Right.
quantitative model of qualia. There's no emotion in it.
Right.
And the question is, how can you have perception without emotion? Period. Embodiment means that, there are two ideas. There's that kind of internal motivational state, and then there's this embodiment piece. Both of them are fundamental. Both of them are right.
Yes.
And you can't have perception without either of them.
Right, and even if you're not having high emotion, you have what, like Damasio calls background feelings or somatic markers. You were talking about, so.
But where thoughts come from? Good question. Because you talk to Chomskyans, anybody who's doing real language research right now, how you actually go from a sound to a word, what are the layers that actually lead to this are not clear right now. There has to be a number of intermediate layers, but we don't exactly know how many there are, what they do. By analogy, it's kind of like looking at the different layers of computer programs that you have to have if you're going to go from a set of zeros and ones to having a word processing program. There are all these layers of language. And the same thing happens going between a sound to a word. Siri, you really emphasize how important that is in your book. And I think that, we do all these models about emotion and things, but we forget about how important language is if we're going to have memory, if we're going to retain any trace of what has gone on before.
Yeah. I think I agree with that. I agree that I'm right. Oh, God. Sorry.
These last remarks are really talking to me a lot because I actually come from a background of Swiss psychiatry, and now I'm beginning neuroscience here in New York. And actually, what you are saying, I'm seeing it taking shape now in the real hardcore neuroscience because there is a lot that is being done on, for example, by Bud Craig, on, for example, the role of the insula that actually gives us the somatic awareness that will allow the memory to be encoded in a more relevant way, for example. And this is really like very much what you were talking about, embodied perception. And all the work that has been done on mirror neurons that exactly shows that we know what the other person feels by feeling it and replicating it in our own body. And I think we are really, seeing it coming. Also what you talked about, this oceanic feeling, I think there's also a neuroscience equivalent in the very hardcore neuroscience that is the default system, the default mode system. And I am working on a kind of neurons that could actually make the switch between the active mode and this oceanic just acceptance and go with the flow mode. So I think we are arriving to being able to put things together.
Yeah, I mean, Maggie is the person who runs this neuroscience psychoanalytic discussion group that I go to at Rockefeller University, and that's really, you know, the dialogue. We just read a paper about the default system and these very complicated questions of self-reference and how that works in the brain. I think that's a sticky one that's not quite worked out yet.
No, it isn't, but it's a very exciting domain. I mean, we used to do these studies where you'd put somebody in a magnet and then do a cognitive task, and you'd take a movie of their brain, and then you'd analyze it. Well, you could take the default mode just once, do a whole bunch of offline experiments, do correlations between the offline experiments and that one scan, and get the same activation as we did with the fMRI studies. I mean, it's remarkable. It basically is, in a sense, kind of a system, a net that basically keeps everything focused and allowing the brain to actually be ready for any action.
Right.
And it's a fundamental process. But it also is quite disturbed in psychiatric illness, too.
Yeah, yeah.
As we take the next two questions, this is also the appropriate time to, if you want to, bid for those tickets for What Does Ecstasy Smell Like program. You know, we have touched on that a little bit. Then we'll pass those visitor information cards to the aisles, and as we walk around with the microphones, we'll pick them up. The next two questions,
like
please, as I think we've just got time for two more.
Right to the brain, yeah.
Hands up, anyone?
The receptors are right.
For
I
questions?
know.
Questions?
Wow.
Yes, please.
That's why it's so strong.
Just came to mind, and curious if either of you have thoughts on these experiential, like shaking or seizures, as related to the second brain, the stomach, like the relationship between that.
You know, there was one doctor, a German doctor, who sent me a note saying that I should be checked by a bacteriologist. You know, that it could be some form of reactive arthritis. You know, I don't know. I mean, but so when you're saying the stomach,
You're referring to the enteric nervous system, basically.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, it's all these nodes. It's incredibly complex. But these nodes are not small. They're like the size of a mouse brain, each of them. So you've got all these little mice brains that together are wired up. That's not an uncomplicated system. No. It's an incredibly complex one. And we have very little sense of it. Very little sense of it. It's kind of like, it's in a sense, it's like this galaxy that we know is out there, but no one's ever touched it.
I probably should have moved further down. I didn't get there.
Well, then you get to you'll get to the other brain that men have. Yeah.
Moving back up, Siri. Could you, because Hans did mention your wonderful exposition about an understanding of without language we have no memory. Can you encapsulate that moment in the book when you explain about the twins? About the twins and the experimentation that went on there.
Okay, there's a great study by a wonderful neurologist, A.R. Luria, and he did a twin study, famous in science. This is during the Soviet period in the 30s. There were two twin boys. He called them A and B in this study, of course. And they were completely language arrested. And they had their own private language, so mostly nouns. Now, Luria did an extensive and huge and really very brilliant study of the language between the two boys. And then he took one of them, actually the sort of underling of the twin pair, and gave him language lessons. Now, the boys were delayed not just in language skills, but they were, for example, they could not understand how to play a game with any kind of rules. They had social problems. So he took one boy, the A, gave him language lessons, and the difference, he sped ahead of his brother. He began to have cognitive comprehension of things that he didn't know at all. So his language skills increased, but so did his motor sensory skills. There was a huge difference. And it's probably one of the great examples of an experiment that frankly couldn't be done now.
Well, it's totally unethical.
It's totally unethical.
Totally unethical.
You can't, take one boy away and, do it. But it's a real insight into how language changes, brain function.
That's right. That's right.
And cognitive abilities that go far beyond just, knowing how to use verbs.
Right. I mean, the thing, when you mentioned this issue that they couldn't, without language, and it wasn't just that language was necessary for memory, but the kid who didn't have language couldn't do rule-based behavior or play rule-based games.
Yeah.
I mean, that is so fundamental. I mean, they even talk about this in Boy Scouts. What do little boys need to know? What are the rules? What are the repercussions for not following the rules?
Right.
And who administers the rules?
Exactly.
I mean, they actually talk about this in Boy Scouts administration. And so it's all about rule following.
Right.
That also says something about Boy Scouts. But, this whole issue of learning to follow rules and understanding rules is so important. And the kid without language couldn't even do that.
And also, very typically, the kids had, the pre-training twin language had no first-person personal pronoun, no I.
Wow.
So they had third person. That's something I do talk about in the book a little bit, about that movement between third and first person.
Thank you. No, I thought that was a very important point to make, and it's encapsulated beautifully in the book. We have a question back there, and it's probably going to be our last, I'm afraid. So I'll get the microphone there.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation very much. I'd like to know your thinking on whether the heart has no memory.
Well, let's think. Actually, I think most of what we remember is, is consolidated by emotion. So that things you're really indifferent to, you forget.
Right.
So the heart actually is probably what we remember best.
Right.
These strong emotional memories are what we carry with us, for a very long time. Like that memory of being humiliated by the grown-ups. That is something that's kind of sealed, burned into you. And all the flotsam and jetsam that has no emotional value is often forgotten. And of course, there are good evolutionary reasons for that.
Now, it's interesting, we often think about the heart not having a memory, and that memory is in the cognitive system. But when you actually quantify it, there's something called the Hyman-Hicks law that came about in the 50s, which it can be encapsulated by this statement, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, okay? And that's kind of how much you can retain at any particular point in terms of encoding and then retrieving. The unconscious...
Phone numbers.
Yeah, phone numbers are a perfect example. The unconscious is far beyond that. Like in our studies, when we take a look at the how much is remembered in terms of your key press behavior, you'll remember what you were doing 80 trials before. And this is in a randomized sequence of an experiment. You have no idea how things are going to come about. And most people, if you're looking, let's say a particular stimulus comes up and you're key pressing to approach or avoid it, you're not necessarily going to remember more than 3 or 4 trials back explicitly. But unconsciously, you
remember.
Do.
Yeah, it's like... Has this happened to you? You can't give directions, but your body can tell you how to go? This is another good
That's a nice one.
proprioceptive thing.
Hans, I wonder if you could tell us what's actually going on in Siri's brain as she tries to select the winning ticket out of this box. Give us a running commentary.
Is this for the olfactory?
This is for the olfactory experiment. Yes,
okay.
indeed.
Siri, no, not that one. Not that one.
All right, read it out.
Oh, I have my glasses in my purse. Kimberly Moffat?
Kimberly Moffat is here. Congratulations, Kimberly. And what we've discovered,
Congratulations.
they've not given us just one pair of tickets, they've given us 2 pairs of tickets. So, Hans, maybe you'd like to select one of them.
Or I'd like to go with whoever's gotten one of those tickets.
Not that one.
No, okay, I can't. Come on.
Go.
That's my friend. All right. Karen Brustein.
There you go. Congratulations.
Yay.
Good. All right.
Excellent.
Well, now that you have won something, I think these wonderful people should win something, don't you? And well, it's a part of our Himalayan tradition to accord esteemed guests with a katak, which is a silk scarf that's interwoven with auspicious symbols that will protect them through any seizures you might have. So this is what it looks like. So, you know, I hope you can see this in the light, but are kind of wonderful.
Oh, those are beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So, and because they're silk, they'll keep you warm. So, Hans, thank you for coming down from Massachusetts.
Now, am I supposed to wear this?
Yeah.
If you will.
Oh, you don't say.
And the remarkable, brave Siri Hustvedt.
Thank you very much.
Siri.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have been celebrating the publication of The Shaking Woman,
Really
A History of My Nerves by Siri Hustvedt, on sale right now at the shop. Do join us upstairs. And even if you don't buy a copy, come and say hello directly to Hans and Siri, who would love to hear more of your comments about what you heard this evening. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you. Good night.